Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Norman Alex podcast. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Grout. So Jeff is somebody I actually used to work with when I was the country manager of France for the recruitment company Robert Half. And Jeff was a country manager for the UK. So Jeff had a lot more people to manage, but I had a lot more hair. Now, unfortunately, I've still got a bit more hair, but not as much as I used to have 25 or 30 years ago. So when Jeff left the company, Robert Half, he became a motivational speaker and a business coach, and very well known in the UK. And I thought it'd be very useful to have a bit of a discussion about leadership in challenging times, because the last few years have been quite challenging. And also looking at what makes a great leader and how to build great teams. So, Jeff, perhaps you can start off by introducing yourself.
Well, I think you've probably done that very well on my behalf already. But I'm a business speaker, coach, and consultant. I work with a range of companies, mainly in the UK, but some overseas. And I'm a business author. I've spoken at a number of business schools, as well as companies like Amazon, LinkedIn, Facebook, BT, British Airways. And these days, my focus is primarily on people and performance.
And I know you've interviewed a lot of people and some very famous people like Richard Branson. Are there any people that you've interviewed, and I'm sure there are, who particularly impressed you in terms of their leadership drive and their leadership qualities? And if so, can you explain a little bit why?
Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed probably more than 100 business leaders from sports, business, the military. One of the leaders that really stood out for me was the former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke.
Right.
And Greg, very much an authentic leader. He had the confidence to be himself, approach the things in his way. He was really focused on how important it was for the leader to communicate and take every opportunity in terms of communication. And he said something which has stuck with me ever since. He said, leaders must first listen to earn the right to be heard. And of course, what he's actually saying is, in organizations, it's communication that's the glue that binds the organization together. But good communication is two-way. And what I found is that great leaders go to great lengths to create opportunities for dialogue, opportunities to have a conversation with people on the front line.
And any other people? You mentioned the sports world. Anybody in the sports world in particular who comes to mind?
Well, as you know, I worked very closely with Sir Clive Woodward at the time that England won the Rugby World Cup in Australia. With Clive, I'd say Clive was the architect of a high performance environment. He recognized that he had to bring the team together, whether that be the coaching team or the team itself. And he also recognized that success is not just down to leadership, it's also down to teamship. So, for example, when he took over as England rugby coach back in 1997, he met his players for the first time at a place called Bisham Abbey. And Clive is pretty much a stickler for time, as I am. And it's his first day in the job. It's 10 o'clock when the meeting's due to start, and no one's there. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, players arrive in dribs and drabs, the vast majority of them on their mobile phones. He waited patiently until they were all there, and then he got up and he set out his vision for the England rugby team. And that was to win the Rugby World Cup. And in that presentation, he talked about world-class performance, world-class standards. And he finished his presentation by saying that if England were to win the Rugby World Cup, they would have to operate as one team. And also, he wanted them to develop their own codes of behavior. And the first two codes of behavior he developed was one about punctuality, and secondly, about the use of mobile phones, because most of the players arrived with their mobile phones in their ear. The players came back with their recommendation. Their recommendation was henceforward, every meeting, the players would be in their seats, ready to go 10 minutes before the meeting was due to start. And they called this Lombardi time after the American football coach, Vince Lombardi. Their recommendation in terms of mobile phones was the mobile phone should only be in the player's bedroom or the player's car. And the point that Woodward would have made, had he at that first meeting said, everyone's got to be 10 minutes early, your mobile phones are banned, he'd have lost everybody. A group of grown men would have been saying, you're treating us like children. So from that point on, he developed other teamship rules where the team themselves took accountability and ownership, and therefore they had control of those rules.
So relatively small details, being on time and not having mobile phones, but they did win the World Cup. So they must have had good players as well. And just to move back to the corporate world, Jeff, do great companies breed or make great leaders? You mentioned Amazon, you mentioned Facebook. I mean, these are incredibly successful companies founded by incredibly successful multi-billionaires. But do they breed good management principles and good managers or leaders?
I would say not necessarily. In as much as these organizations, as you say, they have very charismatic leaders in terms of the CEO position.
Is Jeff Zuckerberg charismatic?
Well, maybe not him. Maybe he's the exception, because you haven't got to be a raging extrovert to be a good leader. There are different ways of leading. And as I said earlier, one of the things that I think singled out Greg Dyke was his authenticity. And I think good leaders are authentic. They approach it their way. Some are outgoing, some are very confident, some are quite shy. You mentioned my interview with Richard Branson.
Yes.
I found him totally charming, but he was definitely nervous of the interview. I was interviewing him in front of an audience of more than 1,000 people. And at the end of the interview, he gave me something of a man hug and said, was that okay? So he had, again,
pretty surprising
of humility about him. I think what good leaders are good at is recruiting people around them that actually compensate for maybe some of their own inadequacies. So therefore, I think maybe they are better at recruiting leaders for the organization rather than maybe developing leaders.
And a good interviewer should get names right. And I did say Jeff Zuckerberg instead of Mark Zuckerberg. So I would like to come back to that. And Jeff, we talked about difficult times, so leadership in difficult times and challenging times at the beginning. Obviously, with COVID, the war in Ukraine, the last 3 years have been very difficult. To talk about COVID in particular, what impact did COVID and remote or hybrid working have on the skills necessary to lead and to manage teams?
Well, I think some managers find it difficult leading a team when they're all together in the same office.
Yeah.
You're quite right. With home working, it would create a challenge for many leaders. But I was, I think, heartened by the fact that many leaders responded very quickly, recognizing the need to create a sense of inclusion, to connect people. And yes, companies made use of Teams and Zoom to communicate more effectively. But I think they recognized that they needed to check in with their people as opposed to checking up on their people. And I would say many organizations, their level of communication improved during the pandemic because of the recognition of the need to try and get people to connect together, to network together.
And you mentioned Greg Dyke and the BBC. I mean, the BBC as an institution wouldn't be quoted by many people in terms of great leadership and great management and great communication, certainly at the moment. Do you have examples of companies that really impress you in terms of leadership? When I was young, it was General Electric. They seem to have lost their way a little bit. Which are the companies in today's world that really impress you in terms of leadership and management?
Well, the reality, you're quite right in saying that we go through different phases in terms of what is a good company. You mentioned GE and Jack Welch. At one stage in the UK, Marks and Spencer was
Yeah.
held to be a great organisation. So they sort of wax and wane. I think there is a demand by many younger people to work for tech businesses. But I think there are companies in other fields far less glamorous. They might be in waste disposal, whatever, that are extremely well run. And they've got leaders that recognize they have a responsibility to take people on a journey. And if that journey is somewhere which is first class and 5-star, they'll take people with them. So I think sometimes we can look outside some of these glamorous tech businesses and other organizations where there are really well-honed leadership skills.
And just coming back to recruitment, which is something you've mentioned, and it's the area where we both worked for quite a long time. What is the importance of recruitment in developing strong teams, and how should you go about recruitment?
Well, I think it's probably the starting point. If you're going to have the best people on the team, you've got to go out and recruit the best. So I think the first thing is that companies have to be cognizant of the fact, if they are to recruit the best, first they need to win the attraction game. And I would say nowadays, recruitment is as much about attraction as it is about selection. In terms of what they're looking for, I would say one should be very focused on attitude as much as ability. I think a mistake that many senior leaders make is they recruit largely looking at skills, qualifications, and experience. And I believe that in any job, the difference between competent and being excellent is much more to do with attitude and behavior, the level of commitment they might bring to an organization. Do they fit in terms of the culture? And also, to what extent do we understand the value system of the candidate? For two reasons. One, if we understand their values, they're more likely to fit into our culture if they have the right set of values. And also, if we understand someone's values, we can almost predict their behavior. And consequently, this is an area which I believe that many leaders need to spend more time exploring rather than just looking at skills, qualifications, and experience.
And in my experience, there are some very good leaders who are very bad interviewers, and maybe the qualities that made them great leaders may be being disagreeable, being egocentric, a bit sociopathic, are not the best qualities to be a good interviewer, where you need perhaps more empathy and to listen more. Do you share that view?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, leaders talk too much during the interview. Yeah. They talk too much about the organization. They talk too much about themselves. Whereas here's an opportunity to gain evidence about previous job performance. So no, I quite agree.
And just another thing I come across, I recruit a lot in private banking, which is quite similar to recruitment. So you have a team, and obviously within that team, there are different performers, some who are very successful, some who are less successful. But very often in recruitment and private banking or any sales position, when you have to recruit a team leader because the team leader retires or goes on to another position or leaves, the tendency is to take the best producer and make him the team leader. And very often the consequence is the new team leader's revenue will fall, and maybe the revenue of the team will fall, and you're not the best manager or leader because you're the best producer. But on the other hand, if you appoint someone as team leader who's not a good producer or not the best producer, he or she can lack credibility with their ex-peers. How would you go around solving that conundrum?
Well, first of all, it's the example you give is a very, very common example where we take our best sales leader and we put them into a management role. And invariably, they move into a management role because it's their way of getting promoted within their organization. What we need to do is to look at what are the competencies that we require in a manager. And therefore, does this salesperson have those competencies? And in many cases, they won't, because to be a successful salesperson, it's about focus, focus on their own desk, focus on their
Yeah.
own set of clients. To a certain extent, it's about being, protective of those clients. Whereas someone in a leadership role, above all else, has to be generous in their time, generous in their support. And therefore, very, very few successful sales leaders will make that transition into a suitable management role.
I agree. And one last question, Jeff, because we have to wind up now. We've both been in this business for a long time, in spite of the fact we both look very young. How have leadership and management qualities evolved over the last few decades that we've been in the workplace?
Well, I think certainly in those early days, then I think command and control, almost the military approach to leadership was pretty widespread. And therefore you did something because your boss told you to. And therefore there was a level of influence due to that authority the boss had. Nowadays, it's much more about collaboration, about cooperation. And what do younger people in the workplace need from a leader? And nowadays, it's much more about someone being supportive, someone being a guide, someone letting go, somebody who, in a sense, makes it clear in terms of what they're looking for, and then giving autonomy. So I think this changed quite a lot. And nowadays, force of personality, force of will won't make you a successful leader. It's very much about listening, supporting, and guiding.
But when I look at the new generation, the so-called Generation Z, a lot of them have decided that they don't want to work as much as previous generations. They're very autonomous. They're very attached to their personal life and to traveling. How do you see management evolving in the future when you have to manage people like that if they are actually in the workplace?
Well, I think sometimes we talk too much in terms of generalizations. There are certain issues, as you say, in terms of Generation Z. I don't think it's widespread necessarily. I think the difference is they don't expect to stay with one company, that's for sure. They believe that they are in control or in charge of their own career, not an anonymous company of some kind. And therefore, I think they want a greater mix, as you say, of work-life balance, because many of these people are our sons and daughters who believe that we pay too high a price for our success. So yes, they want a career, but also they want a life to go along with it. And a good leader is someone who's flexible, someone who's adaptable to meet the needs of their team. And consequently, the first thing is to find out what each team member needs from them. And then once they've done that, then they'll probably be offering a lot of different approaches in order to get the best out of their people.
So coming back to communication, listening, and empathy.
Yeah, as Greg Dyke said, leaders must first listen to earn the right to be heard.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much for that valuable advice. It was great to catch up with you and speak with you again. And I hope that we will meet up in sunny London in the next few weeks.
That'll be very good. And I wish you every success for the remainder of 2023 going into 2024 and beyond.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Speak to you soon.
All the very
Bye.
best.